The wind was mean that evening, thin and sharp as a blade, scraping over the muddy road where Clara Monroe walked barefoot, her torn shawl clinging to her shoulders like something ashamed to be seen. The light was dying, a last gold trembling on her face, and every step seemed to pull another whisper from the darkened porches behind her. "There goes Hank Monroe's wife," someone said. "The one he caught with the ranch hand." The words followed her like a curse, fluttering through the dust. She kept her chin high, though her eyes, tired, bruised by sleepless nights, spoke of someone who'd been hit in a place deeper than flesh. The sun sank, and the earth swallowed her silhouette whole. She reached Eli Granger's ranch just as the horizon turned blue-gray. The barn door stood open, a shadow of a man moving inside. She'd come to sell him her father's mule, though even saying her father's name still felt like stealing breath from the dead. Her hands shook as she tried to lift the saddle. It slipped, heavy, the edge catching her wrist with a sharp, biting pain. She hissed softly through her teeth, whispering, "There, it hurts." A man's voice came from the dim barn, low and rough as gravel smoothed by years of silence. "Let me." Eli Granger stepped into the fading light, broad-shouldered, face carved by sun and solitude. He took her wrist gently, his thumb brushing the dirt away as if that simple act were something sacred. For a heartbeat, they both froze. The air thickened. Her pulse raced under his fingers. Then she pulled back, quick, embarrassed by her own weakness. "Thank you," she murmured. He didn't ask what had happened or why she stood there alone in the cold. He just nodded once and helped her tie the mule near the fence. When he offered her a cup of water, she took it, eyes downcast. As if even thirst were something to apologize for. That night, the town was alive with lamplight and rumor de T. May Hensley's store. The air smelled of tobacco and flour as the women gathered like crows at a carcass. May leaned across the counter, whispering, "Clara Monroe went to Granger's ranch after dark. They say she's lost her shame." Sheriff Dalton's voice rumbled from the corner, slow and self-righteous. "A woman like that brings sin wherever she walks. A man oughta guard his land from her kind." Their words spread faster than prairie fire, licking at every porch and passing wagon. Meanwhile, Clara sat alone in her little shack outside town. The single candle threw shadows that swayed across her walls like ghosts. She unwrapped her bruised wrist, fingers trembling. The bruise bloomed violet and yellow, the mark of something she hadn't deserved. Her tears came soundlessly, too tired for sobs. Outside, the wind cried for her, the only thing that dared to speak her name. Eli Granger lay awake that same night, listening to the distant howl of coyotes. He thought of her eyes, defiant, yet breaking, like the last leaf clinging to a dying tree. He'd seen plenty of pain before, men torn open by stampedes, horses that starved through winter. But nothing in his 35 years had rattled him like the memory of that small, trembling wrist that by morning. The mule was still tied to the post outside his barn. She hadn't come for it. So he saddled his horse and rode toward her shack. The frost crunching under hoofbeats, he found her kneeling near the fire pit, her face pale against the smoke. Clutching her wrist again. "You didn't come for your mule," he said quietly. "Didn't feel welcome to," she murmured without meeting his eyes. He dismounted and knelt beside her, taking her wrist again, slower this time, as if afraid she'd vanish. He cleaned the wound and bound it with a strip of linen from his pocket. His voice was careful, each word weighed before it left his lips. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, like the brief warmth when two travelers share a single flame in the cold. Days turned into a quiet rhythm. She began helping around his ranch, just until her wrist healed, mending shirts, feeding chickens, scrubbing the troughs. He let her stay without comment. They worked side by side, saying little, speaking mostly through the small sounds of labor, the clank of metal, the soft whicker of horses, the whisper of her dress against hay point one morning. The ground was slick with frost. Clara carried a bucket of water toward the barn. Her foot slipped. The pail tipped, spilling silver arcs across the dirt. She gasped and fell forward. Eli caught her before she hit the ground. For a breathless second, they froze. Her breath brushed his neck, and he could feel her heart drumming against his chest. His arms circled her waist, holding her steady. She whispered again, "There, it hurts." But the words carried more than pain. They carried confession that he looked at her, eyes dark and steady, his face inches from hers. He didn't move closer, didn't dare. The air between them was trembling, alive with something fragile and forbidden. Then he stepped back, slow as a man walking away from a cliff's edge. "You should rest," he said softly. She nodded, turning away, but the silence afterward felt heavier than any embrace. It lingered, quiet and electric, like the taste of rain before a storm. By week's end, tongues wagged again in town. Someone saw Clara hanging laundry behind Eli's barn. Someone else claimed she'd moved in. The rumors coiled like snakes. When Sheriff Dalton rode up to the ranch with 2 deputies, the sun was already low, spilling red over the horizon. He dismounted and spat into the dust. "You're not his wife," he said to Clara. "You'll ruin him too." Eli stood between them, calm but unyielding. "She's done no wrong here," he said. The sheriff's mouth twisted into a sneer. "You think that matters to anyone?" They laughed and turned their horses, but not before one of them muttered a word so foul Clara felt it slice through her like a whip. After they were gone, she stood still, hands trembling. "You shouldn't have done that for me," she whispered. "Didn't do it for you," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. But they both knew that wasn't true. That night, the first snow fell. Clara woke before dawn and found him outside, chopping wood in the pale blue cold. Steam rose from his breath, his movements sure and steady. For a long time, she just watched, his strength, his solitude, the way the snow caught in his hair like ash. He looked up and met her gaze. Something softened in his eyes, something human, unguarded. "You staying?" he asked quietly. She hesitated only a moment, then nodded, no declaration. No promise, just a small, trembling smile breaking through her tears. The light spilled over her face as the camera of memory lingered on the woman who'd been whispered about, shunned, bruised by the world, and now, finally, was beginning to look like someone who might believe in warmth again. The wind moved through the valley, carrying away the last of the gossip. All that remained was the faint echo of an axe striking wood, steady as a heartbeat. And somewhere deep inside her, for the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. Winter came quiet and heavy, blanketing the valley in a kind of hush that made even the cattle walk softer. Days shortened, nights grew long and silver. At Eli Granger's ranch, the cold pressed against every window pane, but inside, warmth found its way through smaller things. The scrape of wood against wood as Clara folded kindling. The soft thud of Eli's boots as he came in from the barn. The quiet sound of 2 people learning to exist in peace. They worked side by side now, their rhythm easy and wordless. Clara's hands, once trembling from fear, had steadied. Eli's once cautious eyes had learned to linger without shame. There were moments when she hummed under her breath, songs with no words, only breath and memory, and he'd pause mid-work to listen. The sound was like a bird rediscovering its wings. Sometimes she'd watch him from the porch as he mended the corral fence. Sleeves rolled, patience endless, the late light glinting off the curve of his jaw. She admired the stillness in him, the way he moved through life as though listening for something greater than himself. There was no seduction here, no grand confessions. Just 2 wounded souls slowly finding the courage to breathe the same air again. What grew between them wasn't loud or rushed. It was something sacred, built on small kindnesses that neither dared name. Then one evening, a storm rolled in, not from the sky, but from the road. Hank Monroe had come back that he rode in drunk. His horse lathered, his coat dusted with frost and fury. The sound of hooves shattered the quiet, and Clara's breath hitched as the door burst open. "You're my wife? Damn you," he shouted, his voice raw with whiskey and failure. His hand shot out, seizing her arm. The grip made her flinch. "You think you can shame me? Run to some rancher like a stray?" She stood her ground, trembling but unbroken. "You lost that right when you raised your hand to me," she said. Eli stepped from the shadows, his voice a calm that could break a storm. "Leave." Hank turned, sneering. "And who the hell are you to tell me?" He drew his revolver, the metal glinting under the lantern light. Eli didn't move, didn't even blink. "You'll have to shoot me to take her," he said. For a moment, the world went still. The snow, the fire, even Clara's breath. Then, Hank's shoulders sagged. He spat in the dirt, the rage leaking out of him like a dying flame. Without another word, he turned his horse and vanished into the white dark. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Clara collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking. Not from fear she knew well, but from something stranger, the shock of being defended, of being worth standing up for. Later that night, the fire burned low, throwing slow, amber light against the walls. Clara sat by the basin, washing her wrist, now reopened from Hank's violent grip. She winced, whispering under her breath, "There. It hurts." Eli froze by the doorway. Those words, those exact words, carried him back to the night they met. But this time, he didn't stand still. He walked to her, slow and sure, like a man approaching a wounded animal he meant to free. He knelt beside her, took her hand in his, and began wrapping it with his own torn handkerchief. His touch was gentle, reverent, as if afraid of mending something not his to fix. Clara's gaze lifted to his. There was no shame there now, only exhaustion and a fragile kind of trust. "Why do you care, Eli?" she asked softly, her voice trembling like the edge of a prayer. He looked at her hand, at the bruise circling it like a ring made of sorrow. "Because you stopped pretending not to hurt," he said simply. Then, almost fearfully, he did the unthinkable. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed the scar. That it wasn't hunger. It wasn't lust. It was something holier, an unspoken promise between two souls who had been hurt too long. Her tears came freely. He didn't wipe them away. The fire popped softly, filling the silence between heartbeats. It wasn't passion that filled the room. It was peace. By morning, the storm outside had cleared, but a new one brewed in town. Word had reached Sheriff Dalton that Eli Granger was harboring a married woman. The sheriff arrived by noon, warrant in hand, righteous fury in his eyes. Behind him trailed a crowd, half curious, half cruel. "Eli Granger," the sheriff barked. "You'll hand her over to her husband or face arrest." Eli didn't move from the porch. "She's no man's property," he said, "least of all his." The sheriff's face darkened. "You defying the law now?" Eli's hand hovered near his belt, though no weapon showed. "I'm defying injustice," he said quietly. The sheriff raised his gun. The crowd gasped. Clara stepped out beside Eli, shoulders square, fear buried deep. For a heartbeat, it looked as though everything would end there. Two souls standing against the weight of a town's judgment. Then May Hensley's voice rang out. "She's done more work for this town than any man here," she said, stepping forward from the crowd. "Fixed my boy's coat, nursed half your sick through the fever last month. And you want to run her out again?" Murmurs rippled. Someone nodded. Then another. Slowly, the tide of shame turned, not toward Clara, but toward the men pointing guns at her. The sheriff hesitated, then holstered his weapon. "Fine," he muttered. "But when trouble comes, don't say I didn't warn you." He turned his horse, and the crowd scattered. For the first time, Clara didn't tremble. She just stood in the snow, the light catching in her hair, her breath steady. The storm had passed, and she was still there. When the last hoofbeat faded, Eli turned to her. His voice was low. "You can stay," he said, "or go where they can't reach you." She looked at the land, the fences, the barn, the ridge where the morning sun always rose. Then she looked at him. "This place knows my name now," she said softly, "and I'm not afraid of it anymore." He nodded. They stood in silence, snow falling around them like forgiveness. Then, shyly, her hand slid into his. The next morning came brighter than any before. The valley shimmered under a thin sheet of frost, the kind that turns every branch to silver. The barn doors opened with a groan, and Eli's horse snorted clouds of white breath into the air. Clara walked beside him, her hand now fully healed. Only a faint scar glinting where the wound had been. He glanced at her, a quiet smile tugging at his mouth. "You staying for good?" "Only if you promise not to fix what's not broken," she said. Eyes warmed as he laughed, soft and real, the kind of laugh that sounded like home. She smiled back, the cold air turning their breath into small ghosts that disappeared into the morning. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark began to sing. The years would pass. The land would change. But stories like theirs would linger, half truth, half legend, told around campfires and porch rails by men who'd never known their kind of courage. They said she came to him shamed, the old voices would whisper, and left him changed. But maybe the truth was simpler. Maybe hurt recognizes hurt, and healing doesn't come with thunder or applause. Maybe it comes in silence, in the way a man chooses not to look away from a woman who's been forgotten by everyone else. The camera of memory pans wide. Clara and Eli walking side by side through the snow. Two silhouettes swallowed by morning light. And as the voice of the storyteller fades, it leaves a final note in the air. If you've ever been judged for the scars you carry, remember, love isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just the sound of someone staying when the whole world walks away. The light swallows them whole. The screen fades to gold. The story ends where it began, in silence, and the fragile mercy of being seen.